Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. Today, we are going to talk about what it means to be API first, really, right? So, I'm going to try and talk you through about what it really means to be API first and why you need to have a platform to really be an API first organization. So, before we jump in, let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Nuwan Dias. I work as a VP and Deputy CTO for WSO2. I am also the co-author of this book that was released a couple of years ago on microservices security. You can find my LinkedIn and Twitter handle on the screen. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm more than happy to, get in touch with you and discuss topics on similar interests. So that's about me. So let's dive in quickly into our topic today. So what does it really mean to be API first? What does it mean to be an API first organization? So I like to see or think about API first as a culture, not just a set of things or a practice, but as a culture that an organization should, breathe in, breathe out, day in and day out, right? So it should be something you live in your day-to-day life, in your working environment. So most people define API first as becoming, interface first, or most people think that API first is a matter of, writing the interface of the API before you write the code. Well, that's an important aspect to it, but really, it's mostly a cultural aspect in an organization. There's a lot more to it, to being API first, than writing the interface before you write the code. So let's, try to see what it really means to have an API first culture. So I want you to think through this question and see, okay, if you were to answer this question, what would it really take, right? What if you had to answer this question today? What would you do? What does it mean to have an API first culture? Well, in today's world, what you would simply do is ask ChatGPT, right? So if you ask ChatGPT what it really means to be an API first organization, or what it means to have an API first culture in your organization, it would give you a pretty good answer, right? So I've summarized it out for you. The main points it highlights, and I think this is a pretty good answer in terms of what it really means to be or to have an API first culture in an organization. So this talks about treating APIs as first class entities. It does include the aspect of design first, which we touched upon previously. It talks about the importance of cross functional collaboration. This is about how do you talk with internally within teams through APIs, how do you talk outside your organization through APIs, and all of that. It talks about the importance of having good API documentation, testing approach, which also includes things like release management and so on. It touches upon the importance of becoming developer-centric, meaning, thinking about the consumers or developers of your APIs, right? And then how do you treat them? What do you have to do in order to have a culture that supports them without their clients breaking, and so on. So, right? So there are a bunch of stuff that's included here, which contains reuse, scalability, security, and a lot of other important aspects, right? So what I plan to do today in this session is to touch upon a few of these, not all, obviously, and explain why they are important and what it really means to practice these points in your organization, right? And then we are going to look at how a platform, since we are of course in a platform summit, how a platform is really adds value in order for you to practice this culture in your organization. So now, if you take a step back from all those and ask the question of who really wants to become an API first organization, right? If you ask that question, and if you really think about it, the answer is nobody. Nobody wants to be an API first organization. But what does that mean, right? What do organizations really want? Well, what organizations really want is to build their applications in good quality, in reasonable time, and get it out fast, right? And serve your customers and clients, give them a good experience of the services you offer. That's what the organization really, really wants, right? Becoming API first is an important step or a foundational stone in order to achieving that. That's why we are talking about being an API first organization, right? Nobody really wants to be an API first organization. Every organization's actual goal is to build those um, APIs to practice those cultures and to get their applications built in quality, right? So if you look at a type of an application, this is a kind of an application, a standard application that you would see. So if you look at this, you will see that there are different kinds of services like domain or business logic services. There are BFF services, and there are different groups of them. There are connections between these services, right? And there are different types of consumers of these services, where these different consumers are talking to different kinds of BFFs or backend for front ends, right? And there are different types of storage types or system of record, as we call them, right? So this is a typical kind of an application that you deal with in any organization, right? So what we will do is we'll look at this kind of an application and talk about what it really means to practice a culture of becoming API first to build this kind of an application. So when you have this kind of an application, the first and most important thing in order to practice this culture of becoming API first is to identify the API groups or business domains and get your work and scope organized into proper scopes, right? So that includes identifying your business domains, right? And and not just the technical business domains, but also the the non-technical or business, the real business domains, right? So identifying those technical domains as well as the business domains, and identifying which APIs or which services fit into those respective domains. So if you look at this picture, you can see a technical scope or a domain called payments, which belongs to the finance business domain, right? So that's identifying these stakeholders, business stakeholders, is critically important. So this is one important thing to become to practice a culture of being API first. One of the first most important things is to identifying those domains and organizing your work into those domains. Okay, so now after you've got those things organized, and when you're developing these services inside these organizations, these domains, the next most important thing is having a place of discovery, right? So what's the point of getting everything organized and running smoothly if you don't have a place of finding everything that you have in your organization, right? That's another critically important piece, so that you don't go and rework a lot. Instead you reuse and you share your work with other people, right? So you need an API marketplace. An API marketplace is basically a critically important piece, so that you can practically practice this culture of being API first in your organization. So that's another important aspect of this culture. And when you're building APIs inside these domains, right? So another critically important aspect is identifying the scopes of exposure of those APIs. So it's important that every developer, when they are building an API, think about the scope of exposure. Failing to do so would result in a mess, not just a security risk, but also a mess where you lose control of who is accessing which services, right? Which makes it very, very hard for you to go forward, because there are unimagined links to various services, and which can lead to security issues as well. So identifying the scopes of exposure of a given API is critically important. So that's another important aspect of becoming API first. And internal and external APIs, again, are a very important piece of this whole puzzle. So most people think that, okay, you can solve this problem easily by setting up, possibly like 2 gateways, right? Most people don't even consider the internal APIs as to be like managed ones. Most people just consider the external facing APIs only, but having an internal and external API separation is again another critically important aspect. Now, API gateways can help you achieve that, But if you really think about it, it requires a lot more than API gateways to practice this culture properly, right? Now, if you think of it right now, there are big differences in internal and external API cultures. Now, if you have external APIs where people, consume, you need to think about the self-service capability of those APIs. Can people sign up to use them? How do they get their keys? What kind of quotas do you get them? What kind of monetization policy do you have on those APIs? They are all important when you think of APIs that you need to expose externally. But when if you have an internal API ecosystem only, you don't really have to worry about them. But then what you have to worry about are, okay, how do I discover everything that I have internally? That's where the marketplace piece comes in. How do I obtain connections to these internal systems, right? You need to have simple ways of connecting to them. So this separation and thinking about them in your day-to-day work is also important to practice a culture of becoming API first. So version management or the ability to change and evolve and go forward fast enough, right, is a huge challenge to many organizations. And versioning itself is very complicated, right? So if you really think about it, there are versions in APIs. Basically, these are the versions to expose to your consumers. And there are versions of your source code. If you're operating in a cloud native like Docker, Kubernetes environment, there are tags on the Docker images, right, which are also a kind of version, right? Then there are versions of the components you consume. So how do you link all of these things together, and how do you keep sanity or maintain sanity in all of them, right? Because at the end of the day, these are all tied to the API version of the API that you're exposing to consumers as well, right? It's not just an internal thing. So this is another big challenge to deal with, and you need an organized and a clear way of handling these versions in your organization to really become an API first organization. And not just on how you version, but right. So this particular slide talks about the importance of scale, right, and the importance of cost, right, and performance of APIs. So this is again another critically important aspect of becoming an API first organization. We can talk about APIs, developing more and more APIs, but they don't come for free. There are huge costs associated to running APIs in ecosystems, right? So you need to think about what kind of aspects to deal with when you are building APIs, when it comes to considerations of scale and cost and performance. So you need to think about, can I improve the performance of my API through caching? Can I change the style of my API to improve its performance, right? And also you can deploy many APIs into the system, but they start consuming your resources. Okay, some APIs you may not need to be running 24/7. You may only need them on demand, and they may not be critical, or there may not be a requirement to have them up and running at all the time, right? So you may want to bring them down when they are idle. So these are again things to think about when practicing a culture of being API first in an organization, right? So we went through a few stuff that you need to do or need to practice in an organization to really become API first. So, but as we went along, you may have realized, okay, there's really a lot to do, right? And that is true, right? So the reality is manufacturing software in the cloud native era is a hard task, right? And the reason for that is simple. So every organization knows how to handle their business problem, right? They know how to write code to solve their business problem, and they know that that code that they write needs to be taken into production so that they can actually solve that problem. But the things you have to do in the middle to get to that state is very, very complicated. You need to think about CI/CD. You need to think about self-service. You need to think about security, zero trust, authentication, and authorization. All these things we talked about a few minutes ago, right? In order to get there, and that is why this is a hard task. So to solve this problem, we now have a product category called internal developer platforms. So an internal developer platform is a solution that can basically help you to go through all of these things that we talked about, a proper internal developer platform. right? So there's a definition of it from on the site called internal developer platform of .org. So it basically says that an IDP or an IDP should be something that creates golden paths or self-service capabilities to developers, so that it reduces the cognitive load on them, right? So that they don't, really have to think about all these things in detail that we went through, right? But they should be able to get the benefits of them anyway, right? So that is that is what this definition is trying to say. So when it comes to the context of being API first, I like to see the internal developer platform as a tool that should elevate the experience of developers of becoming API first, right? Elevate it to a level that they can practice, they can deal with this on a day-to-day basis, right? So these are all things that you have to do on a day-to-day basis, right? So an IDP should be something that elevates that experience of achieving these things to a level that you can deal with on a day-to-day basis, right? So at WSO2, at where I work, so we've already done this, and I'm now sharing with you some aspects of how we have elevated that experience, and the fundamental mechanism of elevating that experience is we use an internal developer platform, and we deal with abstractions of these concepts, and that's how we have managed to elevate the experience of developers by building those abstractions, so that they get all these benefits that we are talking about, but they don't have to deal with them at an intellectual level in their day-to-day work. In their day-to-day work, developers focus on their business problem, and they let the platform deal with all those complexities and give them the benefits of becoming API first, right? So we talked about domains at the beginning, but in our developer platform, you don't really deal with domains per se, but you deal with something called projects, which is something that developers very easily understand. And then there are APIs and services and scheduled tasks and things that you run inside projects. So these are called components. So you deal with those components. And when specifying or creating components, you are basically given the choice of picking which kind of exposure you are needed for these services, right? So that deals with the problem of exposure. And there's the built-in marketplace, so developers don't have to worry about discovery or publishing to the marketplace. Everything you add, everything you develop and deploy to the internal developer platform automatically appears in a marketplace. So you don't have to think about the marketplace. It's a built-in feature of the platform. So as I touched upon the scopes of exposure, so we have 3 scopes of exposure. Public means it's out in the internet. Organization means it's out, it's available to anyone in the organization. And project means it's limited to the project you are working on. And dealing with change. So we've introduced something called, we use something called deployment tracks in our internal developer platform. So developers don't have to deal with all the cognitive load of handling that change. So they don't really think of API versions every day for every change they have to make. They only have to think about API versions if they are really coming up with a new business version for the API. But otherwise, they just deal with the deployment tracks, but all their changes are tracked internally and they are versioned. So they don't think about Docker tags, they don't think about API versions or anything like that. They just deal with a concept called deployment tracks, basically an abstraction. Scale and performance, we use Kubernetes and containers behind the scenes, and we have what we call a serverless mode built in, so that any component you add by default is deployed in serverless mode. So that deals with the problem of cost, right? So unless it is essentially required to, these components will not keep running forever. They will run only when there is demand for it, and as soon as it goes into idle mode, they will be shut down and brought back up when there is demand. So that way you save a lot of costs. Security and governance, so we have built in like API gateways. There's an authorization mechanism. There's eBPF based service mesh. So that deals with all the aspects of security. So developers don't have any cognitive load in terms of thinking on the security aspects of them. And we have built in observability tools, so they don't think about observing, setting up observability, because as soon as they write their code and deploy, they get tracing, they get the logs, so everything is coming from the platform. And this is basically showing a cross-section of that platform, of that organization, of our abstractions. So you can see there's a concept called organization, which contains all the projects, and each project has a set of components, which can be APIs, microservices, scheduled tasks, integrations, and so on. And each project has its own environments, like development, staging, and production. So you can deploy to these respective environments. So there's also a concept called data plane, which is where these workloads actually run, and they can be on any cloud of our choice. So that's basically how we have created our abstractions. And a quick note on our architecture. So this is what our platform's high-level architecture looks like. So on the development side, it's integrated to our WSO2's GitHub repository. So once you commit a piece of service into a Git repo, our build process automatically triggers and deploys it to the platform. And the platform has all the supportive services that I mentioned about. So developers don't think about basically anything. They just focus on their logic and which project their logic should belong into. So that's what they focus on. And once they commit that code and deploy, everything else is taken care of, right? So it's what you see on the bottom of the screen is the data plane, which can be multi-cloud, as I mentioned. And these octagons that you see are the physical implementations of the business domains. So we use Kubernetes namespaces and various kinds of network policies to implement them, right? And on the top right of the screen, you see the marketplace. So everything you add directly goes into the marketplace. So developers don't have to worry about publishing or making them available in the marketplace manually. It's all automated. And all the stats, the dashboards, everything, again, available on the control plane UIs. So that's basically the architecture of our platform. So that's how we have created our abstractions and elevated our developer experience to a level that they can deal with day in and day out. And by doing that, we basically managed to tick off most of those boxes of what it takes to have an API-first culture in our organization. So thank you very much for your time. I hope this session was informative to you. Thank you.